Good morning. Today is March 23rd, 1999, and I'm Edward Nickerson. I'm usually the person that does the interviewing of the series of the Tri-Corners History Council of Veterans of World War II. Today, I'm going to interview myself, or just talk about my own experiences to contribute to this series. I was in the 10th Mountain Division, which was the only division of its sort, or really the only outfit of its sort in the American Army in World War II. We were trained as mountain climbers, mountain fighters, and in the popular words, ski troopers, although we really didn't do hardly any fighting on skis. And we were a special outfit. Most of us, but not all, were volunteers. But before I continue, I'd like to mention that this area of Connecticut, and like many areas in the Northeast, got quite a few volunteers, and I'd like to pay tribute to them. In Salisbury, a few miles away from here, we're in Canaan, is Reese Harris and David Harris, two brothers. They were both officers in the 10th Mountain. And there was Crosby Wells. All three are thriving and alive today. We have in Canaan Charles Wells, not related to Crosby. We had, who is now deceased, Ben Bush, was a lawyer who was important in organizing the incorporation of the 10th Mountain Division Alumni Association. He lives in Lakeville. I live in Lakeville. And I'm incidentally a retired teacher and a professor of English and a newspaper man at one point. We had Otar Satry, who was one of the famous skiing and ski jumping Satry family, who tried very hard to get in the 10th, even though he was over age, and finally did when he was down in Texas in another outfit in the Army, and they put him in the engineers, and according to his son, he helped to operate the boats that ferried us across the Po River on the final push in northern Italy. Another 10th Mountain man who has been deceased for some years, was from the same family, was Birger Torreson, also a ski jumper. And we have a number of other 10th Mountain people in this general area of Litchfield County, Connecticut. But I'd like to pay tribute to them, and it's at least as much for them as for anyone else that I'm doing this interview, which is a little bit immodest, since I cannot be stopped by the interviewer, because I am the interviewer. I'll start out by showing a picture, the then and now pictures which we like to have. This is quite glamorous. I was on my first leave back from overseas, and actually I had been up most of the night pursuing what might be called debauchery in the big city of New York. My parents sent me to Bach Rock and had this very much glamorized photograph taken of me. That's how I looked. Well, not really how I looked, because they airbrushed away all the blemishes, but there we have it. I would like to show one artifact before I forget, and that is the ski cap that we had, which had a nice feature. You could pull it down around your ears, and in case you're in a high wind, you could put the strap down. And as somebody pointed out, we had this for about a year and a half, the mountain troop training, and it was so good and everybody liked it so much that the Army changed the model. True to the best traditions of the U.S. Army, if it works, change it. And they substituted another ski cap that didn't have the strap under it. It was pretty good also, but not as good. Well, I'll make as short work as I can of the business of entering the Army and the training before I got to the actual mountain troops. I entered in September of 1943, and I was trained down in Fort Benning. I took my basic with a group of people who were going off to the Army Specialized Training Program to study in college. And I was interested in that, and I said, well, what could I study? And they said, it's basic engineering or nothing. And I said, I'd rather freeze to death in Colorado than study quadratic equations, because I was never any good at any of that stuff. So in January of 1944, I went off to Camp Hale, Colorado. Camp Hale is quite an interesting, was an interesting place. It's at 9,400 feet is the lowest elevation. It's in a dried up lake bed, way up high in the Rockies, maybe 80 or 100 miles from Denver, I'm not quite sure. And extremely high elevation, which took you quite a lot of time to get used to. When I arrived, they put me on KP and guard duty for 2 weeks until I was acclimated to the altitude. And even then, I was not fully acclimated. Some people actually had a hard time adjusting and had to be washed out. The weather was lovely, cold and clear most of the time. It was good ski weather, but our valley was filled with soot from the soft coal that was burned to heat the barracks, and from the trains that went by, which also burned soft coal, so that we looked like Pittsburgh at 10,000 feet. And this caused a lot of health problems, and we had an unusually bad record of respiratory diseases because of the pollution. And this ultimately affected me too. But the training was, I think, very good as I look back upon it. We had wonderful equipment. I remember the first exercise I went on, we hiked up to about almost 11,000 feet up this highway with our skis on our rucksacks in a kind of an A-frame. Our packs were here and then the skis were strapped on. And the total weight of the skis, the rifle, and the packs that we had was about 90 pounds, and it was pretty rough. But we hiked up very slowly. We got up to Tennessee Pass, which was the height of land. On one side, the land sloped down towards the Atlantic Ocean, and on the other side, it sloped down towards the Pacific. And then we hiked off into the mountains and set up bivouacs, did various tactical exercises. We were not allowed to have fires because the Germans were supposedly nearby, even though they were really 7,000 miles away. And it got to be about 5 or 10 degrees below zero. Came time about 2 in the morning. We finally were able to go to bed, and what we did was to scoop out 6-foot-long holes in the snow, put down some pine branches, and without any tents, we lay down our eiderdown, double eiderdown and goose down sleeping bags, and I crawled into mine after taking off my boots and a few things, and I was warm as toast. It was quite miserable getting up in the morning. And that's the quality of the equipment we had. We had several exercises like that. They were quite brutal. On one exercise, when we skied for 20 miles, the fellow behind me just dropped in his tracks from exhaustion. I remember returning to the barracks once and being so tired that I couldn't climb up to the upper bunk where I lived, and I just lay down on the floor and went to sleep. Partly as a result of lingering cold I'd had and the pollution, I ended up with pneumonia, so I spent about 2 months in the hospital and another month at rehabilitation school. And I missed one of the major maneuvers the famous D series that people who were on it still talk about. And there were a lot of people in the wards that I saw as I became ambulatory. I saw whole wards full of men with frozen toes, and they had little tents over their feet. And I remember seeing at least one ward full of about 40 beds with people with frozen toes. But I would say that in most cases it was, if they did get frozen feet, it wasn't the fault of the excellent equipment we had. We had boots with felt liners, felt innersoles. We had huge, thick knit socks, 2 pairs. And if you took care of yourself according to the way they told you to do, you managed to stay not warm, but at least not freezing to death. After this training, we were sent down to Texas because the Army wanted to equip us with some heavier equipment, and they didn't really know how to do it up in this precipitous altitude. And so they sent us to Texas, Camp Swift, in the end of June of 1944, which caused a terrific drop in morale. And we had a lot of trouble adjusting to the heat. But we did, probably from the Army's point of view, get to use some heavy equipment and motorized equipment we hadn't been used to. We did keep our mules, however, and our artillery, more or less unique in the Army, was 75 millimeter howitzers, which were carried, I think, by a total of 6 or 8 mules. The barrel was carried by 1 mule. The various parts of the howitzer were carried by other mules, and finally there was the ammunition. And these were ornery critters, and I had to deal with them on occasion during maneuvers. And I remember one mule running away with me. I was hanging on to his rope halter when we were strafed in a simulated air attack. The Air Force very kindly flew over at about 50 feet above the ground, and they scared the mules into the mesquite, into the brush. It was about 95 degrees, and my mule would not budge. And I got a hold of his rope halter and I pulled, and he just lifted me up. His neck was so strong that I was hanging on to the halter with both hands, and he just raised me above the ground as if to say, "What are you going to do now?" Finally, one of the mule skinners, these were the mostly southern and Appalachian fellows from Arkansas and Kentucky and Tennessee, and they were kind of leathery characters who had lived all their lives with mules and farmed with them. One of the mule skinners came to my aid, and he explained to me that you just have to know how to talk to a mule, whereupon he whomped the mule with what looked like a billy club alongside of his jaw, and the mule eventually came along. We were finally, after despairing of our situation and feeling that we were the forgotten special outfit, suddenly in the fall of '44 we got a new divisional commander, and we were shipped overseas to Italy in December of '44 and early January of '45. Different regiments went over at different times. We arrived in Pisa, and after a very brief time there, were sent up into the mountains, where we lived in villages with the people of the little village of Gavinana, where I was in Tuscany, who were so kind to me and so friendly that I'd like to mention them even today, just in case somebody will ever see this and go to Gavinana. It's a lovely little town, not a tourist place, and it was right near a ski area in Italy, and at that time the Germans were in the ski area, which was Abetone, and they actually used a ski lift to ferry their troops up to observation posts, and we were down below. This is the Apennines, not the Alps. This was not more than 40 miles, 40 or 50 miles from Florence. We were thrown into an attack in February of 1945, and although the front was crumbling in Europe and the Allies were advancing into Germany, the German army in Italy was quite intact. They didn't have a lot of replacements from other countries, like on the Western Front they had Poles and other conscripts and Russians who didn't really want to fight for them. These were pretty much all Germans, although there were some very young and very older men, considerably older men. And we went through a lot of combat in a short time. I was not in for very long. Now that gives me the general, I think the general outline of what we got involved in until the time that I got into combat. That was February 19th, or the February 20th, that we assaulted Mount Belvedere, and part of the outfit climbed a place called Riva Ridge, for which a horse race was later named, and did that at night using ropes, and that was quite an exploit, and that was the exploit that gets mentioned in the press. And I was not on that particular operation, which only took a few hundred men, and we actually had about 9,000 infantry in the whole outfit and a total division of 15,000. But I did fight on the shoulder of Mount Belvedere, and we had fairly bad casualties. We were brought back down and set up again for further exploration, exploration is not the word, but penetration of the German lines and carrying along a ridge until finally, after many days and weeks of mild combat, we had two really horrendous days in which my company took this very, very heavy casualties on April 14th and April 15th. And this is made ironic when you consider that the war ended in Italy on May 2nd. But we didn't know that, and it didn't seem to us any different from it would have seemed if we had been in the middle of the war instead of at the end. And my company lost about 100 casualties and 25 killed, 100 wounded and 25 killed in 2 days on April 14th and April 15th. Now, I was in a platoon of about 42 men. On April 14th, we started our attack with about 42 men, and April 15th, there were 4 men. And I had been a lowly private first class, and I was told to take over some sort of non-com duties at the end of the first day. At the end of the second day, I was told to assemble a platoon, and I found for one very short moment that I was actually in charge of the platoon. 3 other men walked up, and after we had done heroic things, I will say, that second day, some of the men had just behaved as if they were in the charge of the Light Brigade and didn't care whether they were going to live or die. After all that, one of those men walked up and said, "I have a terrible boil on my neck and I'm going to the rear. I don't care who knows it. And I want to get it treated." So then the platoon of 4 men was reduced to 3 men, and they dissolved the platoon, and for about 2 weeks we didn't have a platoon. We became one of the other platoons. And we brought in replacements. I became a squad leader, and then as others came back, assistant squad leader. We had a squad of 10 replacements and 1 other fellow and I. And there was only 1 other fellow in the squad who had been with us when we came overseas. And he was killed, and I was with him when he was killed. So I ended up feeling that I either had a charmed life or I was doomed. But the war ended as we were going up the side of Lake Garda in Italy, and I found myself surviving. I had also been wounded myself. Let's just take a short break while we shift gears. Rather than go into a lot of details of combat, which we have heard from other people, I thought I'd tell a couple of stories that illustrate to me some of the strange, absurd, even comic and sometimes tragic things that occur in warfare. At one point in March, or very late February, early March, we were to attack a small objective from which the Germans were believed to be retiring, and it was not to be a big attack. And we spent the night before the attack sleeping on the reverse side of a very, very steep slope. I remember we had to dig a little wedge in there, and I could barely keep from rolling down the hill. In the morning, we attacked this hill. I was with a friend named Fred Bueller, and these are some of the absurd and strange, as I said, sometimes tragic things that happened. As we ran down the hill, we came across a little valley. We didn't seem to be any opposition. We had tremendous support for our machine guns on the top of the hill. Behind us were firing on the Germans. And we came to a little barn, and Fred said, was next to me, and I said, well, what should we do? And Fred said, well, I'll go to the left and you go to the right. So I did, and he was held up a few minutes, and as he went to the left, there appeared in front of him a German soldier without weapons and drunk, who had decided to stay behind and get himself captured. So Fred sent him to the rear, and we kept on. We dug in on the reverse slope, that is the slope sloping away from the exposure to the Germans, and there didn't seem to be any casualties or anything much going on. And then what I didn't know was that our captain, Halverson, had urged the men to move onto the forward slope facing the Germans. But somebody said, well, Captain Halverson, there's a sniper out there, a German sniper, and we don't see any particular reason to move out into the forward slope where he can pick us off until somebody can get the sniper. Well, Captain Halverson wanted to show us that he was a leader, and he said, that's baloney, there's no sniper up there, so I'll show you. So he strolled along the height of the little hill, which was in the woods, and not a big hill. And suddenly he said, ooh, and the sniper had shot away his earlobe. So he said, well, there is a sniper up there. Now, we must have a sniper in this outfit. And the word came down that my platoon was the nearest one. And he said, we have a sniper in the second platoon. And somebody said, yes, it's Nickerson. Because I had a Springfield, 1903 Springfield with a Weaver scope. And so they sent me up to get at the sniper. But in the business of hitting the ground and getting up and falling down and getting up again and banging here and there, the crosshairs had fallen out of the scope. But I didn't want to tell them that. I didn't want anyone to think I was afraid to go after this German sniper, who was obviously pretty darn good. So I didn't say anything, and I crawled up to this house at the top of the hill, which had been smashed by somebody's artillery, the Germans or the Americans, and I climbed up onto the second and third story. It looked like there was some sort of a, it seemed to me like the attic and what was left of it, when wham, 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 bullets came whizzing all around me and plaster kept falling down, and I said, well, this guy can see me and I have no idea where he is, so I climbed down again. Then I went to the side of the house, which was a big pile of rubble caused by a bomb or shelling, and I said, well, I got to do something. I got to at least find out where this fellow is. So I crawled up on the rubble, and as soon as I moved, the man would bounce bullets right near the rubble where I was. So this is where you might say life begins to imitate the movies. I remembered seeing the movie with Gary Cooper playing Sergeant York, and at one point he had put his helmet on a stick and waved it around to distract the Germans. So I said, well, if he can do it, I can do it. So I put my helmet on a stick and I moved it up and down over here, and the man shot at that. And I squinched up with my telescopic sight with no crosshairs, and I looked out and I figured out where he must be firing from, which was a long, long ways away. And I saw a house, and it was 500, it looked at least 500 yards away. And there were 6 windows in the house. So imagining where my crosshairs were, if I had them, I fired at each one of those 6 windows. I never saw a German, but he sure saw me. And he saw our captain. The Germans were retreating generally, and things fell silent. I didn't have a feeling that I necessarily had shot anybody, but just suddenly there wasn't any more opposition at all. And there had been a little bit of artillery fire, but very, very little. And so finally I turned around and went back, and I told my platoon sergeant, who was a marvelous man, I said, there doesn't seem to be anything out there that I can do, and I shot at this guy, or I shot in the direction of this guy, and there's no more shooting. So he shrugged and I shrugged, but on my way back I was told to advance further into the woods, and it was either the same sniper or a different sniper who suddenly shot the man near me in the side, and then as I came back further after my escapade, I found that this same sniper that I had been trying to get had shot one of 2 twin brothers that were in our platoon. And that's the tragedy, because he'd shot him right in the head. And I will never forget seeing the one twin. One of them was named Jesse Eden and one was Bill Eden. And I never can remember which one was killed, but I cannot forget watching that brother lying, clasping his brother to him in a last farewell. So that was one aspect of this day. The final aspect, I think, that perhaps was the absurd part after this comic, tragic event, was that another friend of mine who was of Italian descent and was my sergeant, my squad leader, led a patrol out in the direction of where that house was, because there was no more opposition. And he came back and he said that he had talked to the people in this house, the Italian farmers who had moved back in, and the situation was pretty quiet. And they said that there was a German there who had been firing out one of the windows, and that he had, they were huddling on the floor, and that he had turned away from the window to reload when a bullet went right through the window. There was no glass in the window, and smacked into the opposite wall, whereupon he muttered an oath and picked up his gear and took off. So my squatter said, "Nick," says, "you're a great shot." Now, I don't know which window I was firing at, and I don't even know whether Fred was just trying to help my reputation with that story or not, but that put the capstone on a tale of absurdity and tragedy and everything all rolled into one. And to me, a lot of the time, the war seemed like that to me, that it was not particularly heroic, and sometimes I felt that I was acting a part in a movie, but not very well. But that's one story. Another story was after this is not a war story, but something that you might say not a combat story. After our first engagement, when we assaulted Mount Belvedere and moved out and lost a lot of men, quite a few men. This was in February. I think we had 3 nights and 4 days without any significant amount of sleep at all. I still remember wondering how it was that I didn't feel sleepier. I would fall asleep for 20 minutes and wake up shivering. And of course, I think there was a lot of adrenaline. But we were brought back down and allowed to for a little rest for several days, and we caught up on our sleep, and we were put into a schoolhouse in a town called Campo Tizzoro, Tizzoro. And I remember the schoolhouse very well because instead of having a corridor in the middle and rooms opening off on either side, the corridor was alongside the street and on just one side of the building, and just a single corridor, and facing the windows. And then the rooms they would have been schoolrooms opened off to just the one side of the corridor. At the end of the corridor, there was a bathroom. And it was a typical schoolhouse, not too different from you would see around here. We were on the second floor, and we were sleeping on the polished kind of marble floor in our blankets, and we had just been given the word we were going back to combat, and our hearts were heavy. We were not, after having seen what we saw and endured what we had endured, we were not eager to go back, but we were going to go back. The second in command of our platoon, the second non-common command, was a fellow by the name of Maurice Murphy, Speed Murphy, who's alive today. He was handing out the grenades. Now, a grenade has a pin in it, and it also has a kind of a lever that you hold when you actually throw a grenade. When you use it with your right hand, you hold on, you pull the pin. You never pull it with your teeth the way Errol Flynn did, unless you want to break your teeth. You pull the pin, and as long as you hold that lever down, it won't go off. But when you throw it, the lever releases, and you've got about 3 3/4 seconds before it explodes. You don't want to, it's timed so that it would just be enough time to get through the air and land, and not enough time for the enemy to throw it back unless he's awfully quick. And Murphy was handing out the grenades, and we had started to fold our blankets in little squares, and we were packing up, and we must have been 25 or 30 of us all crowded around in this corridor, which was about as wide as the room we're sitting in. It's maybe from here to the camera. When suddenly, and we were lining up, each of us was to get 2 grenades or whatever, and when suddenly the cry went out, "Grenade," which was something you yelled if there was one that was supposed to explode. And we were all trained to hit the ground. And I remember distinctly running a couple of feet and flipping over and lying behind about this much of a square of blankets. What I did not, and I waited for the explosion, which would come in about 3.5, 4 seconds at the most. What I did not know was that Murphy, having the live grenade in his hand, which was starting to fizz, picked it up and ran into the bathroom in order to throw it into the toilet, but there was somebody in one of the stalls. So he was right-handed, so he held the grenade in his left hand, and then he ran to the window. But there were people in the street below, civilians and soldiers. So he stuck the grenade out. He did not throw it out the window where it would have exploded in the air and probably wounded or killed several people, including very possibly women and children. He just held it under the cornice by the window, and it blew his hand off. And then he staggered back into the hallway where we were all stunned, lying there, not even knowing what was happening. I looked up and I saw him run back, holding his hand, and 5 seconds later, our medical aid man was down there with a tourniquet, and Murphy's life was saved. He lost his hand, and the sense of humor that this man had in his heroism was extraordinary, because our lieutenant ran up to see him as he was being carried on a stretcher with his hand off down to the aid station, which was in the basement of the schoolhouse. And Lieutenant Clayton looked at him, and Murphy looked up with a smile on his face, and he said, "That's all right, Lieutenant. I can always get a job with the post office." And as a matter of fact, he did. He became an inspector. But those are two of the stories that I would like to mention that have to do with two aspects of the war. There were many, many amusing and very many tragic stories. People don't understand, I think, that a great many odd things happen in war. One of the men in our company was killed when a German bullet bounced off the kneecap of another man. It ricocheted off the kneecap. I'm not even sure that it shattered the kneecap, and hit this man in the head, and he was killed. For some reason, some odd and strange facts like that stick in my mind. A couple of more things to say, and I think I'll wind this up. At the end of the war, we were up in Lake Garda, which is a beautiful Italian mountain lake. It's shaped like the Finger Lakes. It's about 35 miles long, and the foot of it is in the Po Valley, and the end of it is practically into Austria, or it goes up near Austria into the Italian Tyrol, and very steep and beautiful mountains. And we were there, and we were beginning to enjoy ourselves and relaxing, and I was sent back to go over the area where we had been in April 14th and 15th to guide the graves registration people. And they said they wanted somebody to guide them through the minefields, which were very thick and everywhere. And I would say that was, of all the duties I had to do, the hardest was that. For one thing, you didn't know when you might step on a minefield. Second, the war was over, and there was no sense, at least the war in Europe was over, and there was no sense of participating in a group struggle. Third, I was with these people from the graves registration outfit who didn't know me or care about what we had been through. And fourth, we had to excavate the bodies of 23 of the men in my company and nearby companies who had been killed and buried by the Italians. And again, once again, I'd like to pay tribute to the Italian farmers in this area. They had buried the bodies because we had just moved on. You know, we were in pursuit of the Germans. And they had carefully taken one dog tag. Each man had 2 dog tags. They'd taken one dog tag off each body, and they had identified, kept a chart of where the body was buried. And they were in relatively shallow graves, and in most cases they had actually put flowers on the grave. So when the graves registration people went through, they were able to excavate these graves, and of course the bodies were already decomposing rapidly, but they had complete records and good identification of each one of these men. I still remember one grave of someone I didn't know, and many people I did know, was at a separate place, and the Italians had decorated the grave and put flowers on it, the people in this house, every day. And that made you feel very good about the people you were fighting among. Another case was when we were crossing the Po Valley, and I did participate in an amphibious crossing of the river at night, which was kind of fun because there wasn't any opposition there, and I felt it was, again, like I must be in the movies, Ma. We were walking through the Po Valley, which is very flat and very rich and has big drainage ditches and fruit trees and wheat fields, and the fruit trees line the wheat fields, and on the fruit trees were little attached little spars, or little sticks of wood about this long, and which were tied to the fruit trees, and on the spars were grape arbors. So the Italians had grapes, fruit, and then in between the trees in these square or rectangular plots they had wheat or other crops growing. And we were crossing coming to a drainage ditch, which was rather deep. I don't know, they had plenty of rain in the Po Valley, but they did use these ditches for drainage and irrigation. And we were in single file approaching this ditch, and it was really hard to get across, and we were tired. And you could scramble across and then sort of go down the side of the ditch and then scramble up the other side. But when I got to this one ditch, there was a family of farmers. And first, one of the young men held out his hand, and you'd jump across the ditch, and he would take your hand and pull you over to the other side, assisted by Papa. Then Mama would give you a glass of wine, or Papa would give you a glass of wine, I guess. So the son pulled you over, Papa gave you a glass of wine. One of the daughters took the empty glass and recycled it for washing. And then another member of the family, I think one of the daughters, would give you a hunk of bread. So we had 150 men go by, and they've handed out 150 glasses of wine, 150 pieces of bread, and 150 handshakes. So that was one of the memories that I will endure. I should say that when I was with that graves registration outfit, I actually went over the area where I had been shot. I'd had my rifle shot out from my hands, and I looked down. I was trying to find that area. I looked down, and there was my rifle. Nothing, because of the fear of mines, people had not reoccupied this area. There was my rifle rusting, and there was the bolt, and there was the bullet fused into the bolt. It had been red hot. Of course, it had gone through and it just melted right into the bolt. And one of my regrets is that I did not save that. I'd like to close by showing one or two pictures of some of the training that we had. This was from an article about showing different aspects of the training, including the mules. And this is a somewhat glamorized photograph of a ski trooper. And there were training of the men with doing their snow plows. We didn't do very glamorous skiing. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me hold this up. I'm violating good principles here. And here's another picture. Now, I must say I was in the hospital during the mountain training and the rock climbing training, but we did have a training in climbing like that. And we did have wonderful, wonderful equipment. Here is another, and this actually is a picture of me at the home of Ben Bush, who has quite a collection in Lakeville, who has quite a collection of snowshoes and rucksacks and the like. So I'll wind this up by saying that I'd like to consider that I'm being interviewed on behalf of all of the 10th Mountain Division people in this area, and I was proud to have served in this outfit. I don't think we won the war single-handedly. I do recognize that the Army publicity people loved us because they could have pictures so they could call us the ski troops. We were a little bit over-glamorized, but we did the job that we had to do. And I think all of us who survived have good memories. Now that's what I have to say.